Revealed as the Tyrant of Badab, Huron Blackheart directs the pitiless reaving of the Red Corsairs with the ruthlessness of a pirate's king. His tyrant's claw crackling talons tear through armor before the inbuilt incineration unit unleashes gouts of sulphurous fire. Hello there and welcome to this particularly exciting video. In this comprehensive and in-depth painting guide, we'll be painting this truly stunning new miniature in great detail, giving him all the attention he deserves. Let's get started. The paints we'll need are on screen now. There are quite a lot of them, but this is an incredibly detailed model and we want him to really stand out on the battlefield. With that said, feel free to pick and choose whichever paint you like. And the same is true for all the brushes and extra equipment that we'll be using. So first, our model needs an undercoat and I've gone with Chaos Black Spray. You could totally use a different undercoat here if you wanted to. I'll leave that up to you to decide. So with the undercoat done and out of the way, our first stage is to start base coating all the armor using Khorne Red. We're free to be quite messy at this stage as it's our first base coat, but being neat will better allow us to see where the other base coats will go later. 2 thin layers later, we're on to our next stage. Next, it's time to base coat all the black areas on the model using Abaddon Black. So that's this armor plate on the middle of the model, the Red Corsairs icon, the undersuit, the back of the cloak, the pipes, and also these backpack canisters. Be extra careful around the red armor that we just painted, but if you do mess up here, you can go back to tidy up with Khorne Red, or you can wait till you've added all the other base coats first. Now it's time for our first metallic. To base coat the trim as well as all the other silver areas on the model, I'm going to be using Iron Warriors. The trim on the box art is a much darker colour than the rest of the silver details, but don't worry about that for now, we'll darken it down later. So right now, just paint all the silver areas using Iron Warriors. Awesome, let's move on now to another metallic. For the metal section on the top of the axe head, the vial lids, and also this melter grill, use Warplock Bronze. This is an awesome colour and should cover pretty easily over our other base coat. With that done, before we move on, let's quickly change our paint water so no pesky metallic flakes sneak their way into our other colours. Cool, with that out of the way, let's move on now to another base coat. This is a quick and easy one. We're just using Rhinox Hide for the axe handle. You will need a couple thin layers of this. Moving on now, for the tabard, base coat it using Dark Reaper. We've got quite a few base coats on the model done now, so be extra careful not to get any of this onto your other colours. Up next, it's shading time. First, recess shade all the armor and the tabard using Nuln Oil. You could apply this all over instead if you wanted to, but doing it this way will give you some much tidier results. Once you're happy with the armor and the tabard, apply an all over shade to all the other base coats that we've applied so far, except the black. With those areas now shaded, now we can go back to base coating. So for all the copper sections, base coat them now with Hashut Copper. You will need a few thin layers of this as it's quite a thin paint, but just be careful around your other details. With that done, that's pretty much all the main sections on the model base coated. Let's move on now to the inside section of the cloak. Let's start by base coating it with Celestra Grey. This part can be a little tricky, just be as careful as you can around the back of the legs. A few thin layers later, you should be left with this. Next, apply a thin glaze of Thunderhawk Blue all over the inside of the cloak. This only needs to be subtle, so keep an eye out for any pooling as you go. Once the Thunderhawk Blue glaze has dried, go back to Celestra Grey to neaten up any mistakes and lay it over the raised areas like so. And there we go, the inside of the cloak is done. With that finished, let's move on now to another shade. To add some warmth and definition to all the brass details, let's use Gore-Grunta Fur mixed with some Lahmian medium. You don't have to add any medium if you don't want to, but the more you add, the more subtle the shade will become. Be extra careful here not to get any of this on the other details that we've already painted. With all the brass details shaded, now we can move on to the few remaining details across the mini that are still in need of some attention. First up, let's pick out the fur and this strange creature known as a Hamadryad. While we're at it, we can also pick out the string on the tabard and all the skulls using Wraithbone. A few thin layers later, all those areas should now have a nice solid base coat of Wraithbone. Next, let's add some definition to them using a shade/glaze of Skeleton Horde. I'm mixing this in with a small amount of Lahmian medium and painting it all over the skulls and fur. I'm not adding it to the Hamadryad yet, or the string on the tabard though. Once again, watch out for any pooling during this stage. Areas like the top of the skulls are a great place to keep an eye on. Once the Skeleton Horde is totally dry, we can leave the skulls there for now. But we can take the fur a little further. We're going to add a couple extra glazes now to create a cool colour transition. Basically, we want the fur around the collar to be the lightest and gradually get darker the further away it gets. So using some thinned down Mournfang Brown, I'm applying this to most of the fur, but just stopping just here, just above the collar. A few thin layers of glazing later, we're left with this. Now this already works quite nicely, but to really amp up the effect, we want to incorporate an even darker colour to go within that Mournfang Brown. So using Rhinox Hide, apply another glaze just to the last quarter of all the fur. This will take it that little bit further and create a more convincing colour transition. And to tie all those different colours together, we can go back in with Wraithbone and pick out all the raised tips of the fur like so. With that done, the fur is complete and looks awesome. There's just a few extra areas to pick out before we can move on to adding some highlights, the main one being the face. Let's start with a base coat of Deepkin flesh. Apply this in several thin layers, focusing more on the consistency of the paint rather than the coverage itself. This will help to avoid building up any unwanted texturing. With that done, we can now paint the eye and tongue using Screamer Pink. We're doing this before the shade paint so we can tidy up any mistakes if we make any. And once you're happy with that base coat, now we can shade the face all over with some thinned down Targor Rageshade. If it's not strong enough or it's looking a little too bright still, feel free to go back in with a second layer. It can be quite tricky to tell if it's too light or too dark at this stage, so if you are unsure, just leave it for now, and once you finish the entire model, you can go back to Targor Rageshade if you think you need to. And while we've got it on our palette, we can also use Screamer Pink to pick out all the spots on the hammer dryer. Next, let's use Corax White to base coat Huron's teeth, all the lenses across the model, and vials. Once you're happy with how all those areas look, as an optional stage, you can add tiny lightning strikes to all the weapons, ready for the next stage. Speaking of which, next, using Aethermatic Blue, we can add a blue glow effect to both weapons. You may find it easier to thin this down and build the effect up slowly using subtle layers, but it's up to you. With that done, let's paint the lenses and vials using Aeldari Emerald. Firstly, pick out the eye lens like so, nice and easy. For all the vials, start by carefully painting a horizontal line across them like so. Then carefully block in the entire underneath section. We're using Aeldari Emerald, but feel free to use different contrast paint instead if you want to. Next, we're going to start to make these vials look really convincing using Nuln Oil. Apply Nuln Oil just to the top section of each vial. And to finish off the effect, add some highlight reflection lines using Corax White. You could also add a tiny dot to the eye lens if you want to, but if you're happy with how it looks already, that's totally fine too. And there we are with the vials finished. Huron Blackheart is well on his way to being ready for some highlights. Before we get to those though, let's quickly move on to the hammer dryer. Start with a thin layer of Gryph-Hound Orange mixed with some Lamia Medium all over. Once that's dry, go back in with a second layer, but just on the spine and end of the limbs. This will create a quick and easy colour transition. For the eyes, inside of the mouth and claws, use some Khorne Red thinned down with Lamia Medium. Be extra careful around those other areas that we've already picked out. And to finish it off, carefully pick out the teeth using Corax White. Nice and easy. With that done, Huron Blackheart is fully base coated and shaded, and if you're happy with how he looks already, you can skip straight to basing. But if you want to take him up a notch, stick around for some highlighting. So for all the red areas, start with a highlight of Wazdakka Red. Remember, consistency is key here. It's not all about painting the smallest lines that you possibly can, and it's far more important that the lines are a consistent thickness. If you want to take your red highlights a little further, once you're finished with the Wazdakka Red, you can add a small amount of Squig Orange to the raised areas and points. Remember, a little goes a long way. For the first black highlight, let's use Dark Reaper. We haven't applied a shade to the black area, so if you do mess up here, it's super easy to go back to Abaddon Black and tidy up. And once again, if you'd like to take the black highlights a little further, you can use some Thunderhawk Blue on the very sharpest and raised edges. Better yet, you can also mix in some Lamia Medium to create a glaze consistency yet again and apply it to the bottom section of the cloak like so. This will result in a really cool subtle blue colour transition which looks great. For all the metallics across the model, highlight them now using Stormhost Silver. So that's the Iron Warriors, Hashut Copper and Warplock Bronze areas. If you're worried about these areas looking a little too bright after this stage, you can stipple this highlight on instead, which is exactly what I'm doing for all the trim, which I want to appear darker. For the brown on the weapon handle, highlight it using Mournfang Brown. You can also mix this in with a little bit of water and add it to the trim on the chest to create the rusty effect that we see on the box art. And you can do the same thing for the bottom of the cloak to add a little bit of weathering. And then, if you fancy it, you can use Aethermatic Blue to add some verdigris to some of the trim like we see on the box art. You can thin this down or add multiple layers depending on how strong we want the colour to be. And there we are, with that done, Huron is fully highlighted and looking awesome. I've absolutely loved painting this guy so far, and all that's left to finish him off is the base. So first, let's paint that huge rock using several thin layers of Stormvermin Fur. Then add the texture paint of your choice. I'm using Astrogranite. Shade it all with Nuln Oil mixed with a tiny amount of Lamia Medium, and once that's dry, finish it all off with a dry brush of Screaming Skull. And then finally, let's go back to Stormvermin Fur to paint the base rim blammo. And there we are, the Tyrant of Badab, Huron Blackheart is finished and ready to lead his raids across the galaxy, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. Well, that's all from me. Hopefully you've enjoyed this in-depth painting guide, and in the meantime, if you are looking for more tutorials, tips and tricks, you can check out some of the other videos on the Warhammer YouTube channel, or alternatively you can head to a Warhammer store where our friendly staff are always happy to help. Thanks again for watching, see you next time, bye bye!